After my daughter-in-law told me that my son needed emergency surgery because his liver disease had reached a critical stage, I walked out of the hospital with tears streaming down my face. But then, the hushed voices of two nurses at the end of the hallway stopped me cold. "The patient has already been admitted, so why isn't his name on the surgery schedule?" one of them asked. The other replied softly, "That's strange. Then where did this surgery order even come from? I'm incredibly grateful to have you here, to help build our community. Please drop a comment below, letting me know which city or country you are watching from. Also note that this narrative blends fictional adjustments for educational value. Any resemblance to actual names is purely coincidental, but the underlying warning remains highly practical. Let me take you back to the first week of June, because the details matter here. Every single one of them. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 62 years old. I founded Vance Construction 31 years ago with a used pickup truck, a second-hand level, and enough stubbornness to outlast 3 recessions. We build commercial properties across the Charleston metro area, warehouses, office parks, the occasional mixed-use development that the city planners love to argue about for 2 years before approving. It is not glamorous work, but it is honest work, and I have always been proud of that. My son Julian joined the company 7 years ago, fresh out of his MBA at Clemson. He is 34 years old, and he is without question the best thing I have ever built. He has his mother's eyes, warm and steady, the kind that make people feel listened to, even when he hasn't said a word yet. Margaret passed away 5 years ago from a stroke that came without warning on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And there are still moments when I turn a corner in our house and expect to see her standing in the kitchen with her coffee. I don't talk about that much, but it shapes everything. Julian married Eleanor 3 years ago. She was sharp, organized, and capable in a way that reminded me of a Swiss watch, every gear turning at exactly the right time. She had worked for several years as a medical records coordinator at Mercy General Hospital here in Charleston, before leaving to focus, as she put it, on building a life with Julian. I liked her. I trusted her. I want to be honest about that, because what comes later will be easier to understand if you know that my trust in Eleanor was genuine, and it ran deep. The first sign that something was wrong with Julian came on a Thursday evening near the start of June. We had finished a late dinner at my house, grilled salmon corn on the cob, the kind of simple summer meal that Margaret used to make every year when the weather turned warm. Julian pushed back from the table and pressed his hand flat against his right side just below his ribs. "You okay?" I asked, watching his face. "Yeah." He forced a quick smile, but the corners of his eyes were tight. "Just a little sore. Probably ate too fast." Eleanor reached over and touched his arm. "You've been saying that for 3 days now, babe. It's not just eating too fast. It's nothing," Julian said, waving it off. But he winced again when he stood up to carry his plate to the sink, and I saw it. I saw it, and I felt something cold move through my chest, that quiet alarm that lives in the body of every parent, the one that fires without permission. Over the following week, I watched my son slow down in ways that were impossible to ignore. He was arriving at the office an hour later than usual. He was leaving meetings early, rubbing his eyes like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. By the second week of June, there were afternoons when I walked past his office and found him leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed at 3 in the afternoon, his laptop open and untouched in front of him. One morning I stopped in his doorway and said, "Julian, talk to me." He looked up, and the effort it took him to lift his head made my throat tighten. "I'm fine, Dad. I just need to get my energy back. Work has been a lot lately." "Work has always been a lot," I said. "You've never looked like this." He held my gaze for a moment, then looked away. "I'll make an appointment. I'll get it checked out." But he didn't make the appointment. Days passed. I watched him push through each morning on willpower alone, eating less at lunch, skipping the afternoon coffee he used to live by going home earlier and earlier in the evenings. On a Thursday, in the third week of June, I finally said out loud what I had been thinking for days. We were standing in the parking lot of our office on Morrison Drive, and I put my hand on his shoulder and told him I was driving him to Mercy General myself that afternoon. Eleanor was with us. She had come by the office to drop off lunch, she did, that sometimes showing up with sandwiches from the place on East Bay Street that Julian loved. She heard what I said, and she turned to face me with that measured, purposeful expression she always had when she was about to take charge of something. "Dad let me take him," she said. She called me Dad from almost the beginning. I had never asked her to, but I never stopped her either. "You have the Henderson project deadline on Friday. You cannot drop everything right now. I'll take Julian this afternoon, and I'll call you the minute we know anything." I looked at my son. Julian shrugged with one shoulder in that way he had the gesture that meant he wasn't going to argue. "She's right," he said. "You don't need to be there for this. It's probably nothing." I hesitated. Julian pulled out his phone and started to open the hospital's website, scrolling toward the appointment scheduling page. Eleanor reached over and gently touched his hand. "Don't bother with that, sweetheart. I still know people at Mercy General from when I worked there. I'll call ahead and get you in this afternoon without the wait. It'll be faster." She looked at me. "I promise I'll call you the minute we have anything." I nodded. I told myself it was practical. I told myself Eleanor knew the system, knew the staff, knew how to get things done without the hours of sitting in a waiting room that I was terrible at anyway. What I didn't notice, what I had no reason to notice at the time, was the small bottle of supplement pills Eleanor had started setting beside Julian's coffee every single morning that week. She had introduced them quietly, almost casually, 2 weeks before placing them on the kitchen counter one morning and saying, "I read that these are good for liver support and general fatigue. Couldn't hurt." Julian had thanked her and started taking them without question. He trusted her completely. So did I. I would later learn that those pills were not a liver supplement at all. Eleanor had taken standard acetaminophen, the active ingredient in common pain relievers available at any drugstore in America, and combined it with a low-dose sedative packing both into capsules that looked exactly like the vitamin supplements she had described. Acetaminophen is safe at the recommended dosage, but taken in excess day after day, week after week, it accumulates in the liver and begins to cause real measurable damage. Elevated liver enzymes. Fatigue. A dull, persistent ache in the upper right abdomen. Skin that takes on a slightly sallow tone over time. Every symptom that would later appear on Julian's real lab results had been quietly manufactured by the woman who handed him his morning coffee with a warm smile every single day. Eleanor took Julian to Mercy General that afternoon. She drove. She walked him in. She stayed beside him through the intake process, speaking with the staff people she had worked alongside for years, people who recognized her face and were glad to help. Julian called me at 5:30 to tell me the blood work had come back with some concerning results and that they were running more tests. He told me not to worry. I spent the next 3 hours sitting at my desk on Morrison Drive, staring at a set of blueprints I couldn't read, watching my phone and doing exactly that. Eleanor's car pulled into my driveway at 7:43 that evening. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock above the fireplace in my living room for the past 2 hours, willing the minute hand to move faster and hating myself for every time I checked it. I heard the car door, then another, then footsteps on the porch, slower than usual. I opened the front door before they could knock. Julian looked exhausted in a way that went beyond anything I had seen from him that week. His shoulders were curved inward slightly, the way a man carries himself when he has been handed news he does not yet know how to hold. Eleanor was beside him, one hand on the small of his back, guiding him gently through the door, the way you guide someone who is not entirely sure where to put their feet. Come in," I said, stepping back. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Julian, sit down. You want water? You want something to eat? I'm okay, Dad. He lowered himself onto the couch slowly, and I noticed he winced when he settled back against the cushions. I'm okay, he said again, and I understood that he was saying it for my benefit more than his own. Eleanor set a manila folder on the kitchen counter between us. She smoothed the front of it once with her palm, a small, deliberate gesture, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, careful and composed, and somehow, I realize now, almost rehearsed. Dad, she said quietly, the results came back while we were still at the hospital. They ran some additional tests because of Julian's blood work, and they referred us to a specialist. I need you to read this, but I want you to know that we are going to handle this together, all three of us. Okay. I picked up the folder. I opened it. The words on the first page hit me the way a truck hits a guardrail, sudden and total and loud, in a way that silenced everything else. Acute liver failure. Advanced stage. Palliative care recommended. I read the line 3 times because my brain refused to process it the first 2. My hands were shaking before I even reached the second paragraph. I could feel the tremor starting in my fingers and working its way up my forearms, and I could not make it stop. What does this mean? My voice came out wrong, thin and cracked at the edges, nothing like my own. Eleanor, what does this mean? It means Julian's liver is in serious trouble, she said. She kept her voice low and level, not cold, but controlled. The specialist they referred us to is a hepatologist, a liver doctor named Dr. Kenneth Walsh. He runs a program out of the Minneapolis Liver Institute. He's one of the best in the country, and he has worked with patients in Julian's exact situation before. I already reached out to his office through the hospital's referral system this afternoon. I looked at my son. Julian was watching me from the couch, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his face carrying an expression of such deliberate calm that it broke something open in my chest. Julian, I said, and my voice cracked completely on his name. Dad? He held up one hand. Don't. Please don't fall apart on me right now, because if you fall apart, I'm going to fall apart, and I really need to hold it together tonight. I pressed my lips together hard. I nodded. I turned around and walked out the back door because I needed 30 seconds where no one could see my face. I stood on the back porch with both hands gripping the railing, staring out at the oak tree in the yard. The one Margaret and I had planted the year we bought this house, and I let myself come apart for exactly as long as I had told myself I could afford to. My chest heaved. My knuckles went white around the wood of the railing. I pressed my forehead down against my hands and breathed through it this crushing, suffocating wave of terror, the kind that only a parent knows, the specific horror of watching your child become fragile in front of you, and knowing there is not a single thing in your power to simply fix it. I gave myself 2 minutes. Then I straightened up, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and walked back inside. Eleanor was sitting beside Julian on the couch, her hand over his, talking to him in a low voice. She looked up when I came back in. I need to know everything, I said. I pulled a chair over from the kitchen table and sat directly across from them. Start from the beginning. Don't soften it. Eleanor nodded. She walked me through it methodically, the blood work, the enzyme levels, the referral, what palliative care would mean in practical terms. She used the kind of calm, measured language that people who have worked in medical environments use, and I found myself grateful for it, even as I felt the ground continuing to shift beneath me. Dr. Walsh doesn't take direct calls, she explained. His program operates through a secure patient portal. It's a HIPAA requirement for high-risk cases like this. Everything goes through the system: consultations, treatment updates, billing. It protects Julian's privacy, and it keeps all the documentation in one place. I've already set up the account for us. I want to talk to him directly, I said. I want to hear his voice. We will, Eleanor said. He'll reach out through the portal within 48 hours with his initial assessment. And once he's reviewed everything, we can request a call through the system. It just has to be documented properly. I looked at Julian. Are you in pain right now? A little, he admitted. It's manageable. Are you scared? He met my eyes, and for just a moment, the careful calm in his face slipped, and I saw what was underneath it, a young man trying very hard to be braver than he felt. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright. Yeah, he said quietly. A little of that too. I reached across and gripped his shoulder hard. We are going to fight this, I told him. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. Do you hear me? He covered my hand with his and held on. Eleanor was already at the kitchen counter with her laptop open, pulling up the portal she had created. She was efficient and focused and fully in charge of the room in a way that I mistook completely and genuinely for strength. I have Dr. Walsh's recommended supplement protocol here, she said, clicking through pages. He wants Julian starting on these tonight. She reached into her bag and set a brown glass bottle on the counter, the same kind she had been placing beside Julian's coffee all week, the ones she had introduced so quietly, I had barely registered them. I already picked up the next supply. Julian same as before, too, with water before bed. Julian reached for the bottle without looking up. Got it. I did not look at the bottle. I did not think about the bottle. I was too busy trying to remember how to breathe. That night, after Julian went to bed, and Eleanor finally left, just before midnight, I sat alone in my kitchen with the manila folder open on the table in front of me. I read every page 3 times. I Googled every term I didn't understand. And somewhere around 1 in the morning, I put my head down on my folded arms and let myself cry in a way I hadn't cried since the morning I lost Margaret. I had no idea that the folder in front of me was fiction, that every number on every page had been invented, that the man whose name appeared on the referral letter had never examined my son at all. I had no idea that the real threat to Julian's liver was sitting in a brown glass bottle on my kitchen counter, 2 capsules at a time, night after night after night. The email arrived on a Monday morning, 3 days after the folder on the kitchen counter had rearranged my entire understanding of the future. I was at my desk on Morrison Drive pretending to review invoices for the Henderson project when my phone buzzed with a notification from the patient portal Eleanor had set up the night of the diagnosis. The sender name read, Dr. Kenneth Walsh, Minneapolis Liver Institute. The subject line said, Initial Assessment, Julian Vance. I called Eleanor before I even finished reading the first paragraph. I see it, she said, picking up on the first ring. Her voice was already steady, already prepared, as though she had been waiting for my call. I've read it twice. Come to the house tonight, and we'll go through it together as a family. That evening, the 3 of us sat around the kitchen table with Eleanor's laptop open between us. Dr. Walsh's email was thorough in a way that felt genuinely authoritative. Detailed references to Julian's enzyme levels. Specific observations about the progression pattern. A proposed treatment protocol laid out in numbered steps with clinical reasoning attached to each one. Eleanor translated the medical language into plain English as we moved through it patiently, never rushing, answering every question before I could finish asking it. He wants Julian to start an advanced supplement protocol immediately, she explained, scrolling down. High-grade compounds that aren't available over the counter. I'll handle ordering them through the portal. And he's recommending we begin a course of specialized IV support at a private infusion clinic here in Charleston. He has a network of affiliated providers. How much is this going to cost? I asked. Eleanor looked at me with an expression that was gentle and direct at the same time. The first phase is $45,000, Dad. I know that's significant, but Dr. Walsh's program has outcomes that standard hospital protocols simply can't match. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even blink. When the man sitting across from you at that same table is your son, your only son, who has his mother's eyes and his grandfather's laugh, $45,000 is not a number that gives you pause. It is simply the next thing you do. I wrote the check that night. 2 days later, I decided I needed to hear Walsh's voice for myself. I told Eleanor at breakfast, and something moved briefly across her face there and gone in less than a second, too fast for me to name. "Of course," she said. "Let me reach out through the portal and request a call slot. It has to be scheduled in advance. He's in procedures most of the day." That same afternoon, Eleanor called me from Julian's house. "Walsh has a window at 4 o'clock, she said. "I'll conference you in." At 4 o'clock precisely, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was unhurried and measured, carrying the particular authority of someone who has delivered difficult news many times and learned how to do it without cruelty. He spoke about Julian's case with the kind of specific layered knowledge that only comes from genuine study. He referenced the exact enzyme ratios from the blood work, mentioned a secondary marker that Eleanor had never brought up, and outlined a treatment trajectory with the calm certainty of someone who had navigated this road before. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, was that the voice I was hearing was not a human being at all. Eleanor had used an AI voice generation program, the kind that had become sophisticated enough in recent years to replicate the cadence and texture of real speech with near-perfect accuracy. She had built the character of Dr. Walsh over weeks, scripting his answers, feeding the blood work numbers into her preparation so that every detail he referenced was accurate. The technology was not science fiction. It was available, it was accessible, and in the hands of someone who understood how to use it. It was completely convincing. When I asked Walsh why we couldn't fly to Minneapolis to meet with him directly, his answer was immediate. "Mr. Vance, I have to be very direct with you about that. Travel at this stage would place real physiological stress on Julian's system. His liver is working at a fraction of its normal capacity, and the cabin pressure changes alone during a flight could accelerate the inflammation process in ways we cannot easily reverse. I need him stationary and stable while we work. And frankly, the controlled environment you can provide at home is better for him right now than any clinical setting." I accepted that. Every instinct I had as a father told me to push harder, to demand a face-to-face meeting, to get on a plane that weekend, regardless of what any doctor said. But Eleanor had spent weeks building a frame around my grief that made those instincts feel reckless rather than reasonable, and I had walked into it completely. Julian was getting worse by the end of July. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the slow, grinding way that wears a person down. He was sleeping 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. His appetite had dropped to almost nothing. The warm color had gone out of his skin, replaced by a dullness that I told myself was the disease, and that was in fact the acetaminophen doing precisely what Eleanor had intended it to do. One evening I arrived at Julian's house for dinner and found him asleep at the kitchen table, his head tipped sideways against his own shoulder, a half-eaten bowl of soup in front of him that had gone completely cold. Eleanor caught my expression before I could speak. "The new compounds," she said quietly, lifting Julian's bowl and carrying it to the sink. "Dr. Walsh said the fatigue is going to be significant for the next few weeks while his system adjusts. It means the protocol is working." She said it so matter-of-factly, so evenly, that I held on to it the way a drowning man holds on to anything within reach. Standing in that kitchen, watching my son sleep in his chair, while his wife rinsed his dishes with the unhurried ease of someone who had everything completely under control, I felt something I am still ashamed of, feeling grateful. Grateful that she was there. Grateful that she knew what to do. Grateful that someone in that house was not falling apart. I had no idea I was standing in the middle of a stage set. Every prop placed with intention, every line already written. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from grief that has nowhere to go. By the 5th week of July, I was living inside that exhaustion every single hour of every single day. I was still going to the office. I was still reviewing contracts and returning calls and showing up to site walkthroughs with my hard hat and my clipboard, because the work did not stop just because my world had. But I was operating on a kind of autopilot that anyone who has ever waited for the worst to happen will recognize immediately present in body somewhere else entirely in mind. Eleanor came to the Vance Construction office one morning that week, which she had been doing more frequently. She brought coffee, set a cup on my desk without asking, and sat down across from me with her hands folded on her knee, in the way she had when she was about to say something she had already thought through carefully. "Dad," she said, "I need to talk to you about something practical, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." I set down my pen. "Go ahead." "The medical costs are going to keep climbing," she said. "Dr. Walsh's second phase alone is going to be another 60,000, and there will be more after that. I've been looking at the liability exposure for Vance Construction. If those bills come due, while the company accounts are structured the way they are right now." She paused. "If Julian's treatment costs exceed what personal accounts can cover, and creditors come looking, the company could be at risk. I think we need to restructure the financial accounts now before that becomes a real problem. I can manage the day-to-day oversight, I know the systems, I know the vendors, and it will free you up to focus completely on Julian." I looked at her across my desk. She looked back at me, steady, reasonable, the picture of a daughter-in-law who was simply trying to hold the family together. "You'd be taking on a lot," I said. "Julian needs you present," she said simply. "Not buried in spreadsheets. Let me carry this part." I agreed. Because she was right, and because I was tired, and because every decision I made in those weeks was made through a fog of fear that made anything Eleanor suggested feel like solid ground. 3 days later, she brought up Magnolia Gardens. We were at Julian's house, the three of us finishing a dinner that Julian had barely touched. He had pushed his food around his plate for 20 minutes before giving up entirely, and I had watched him do it with a tightness in my throat that I could not swallow away. Eleanor cleared the dishes and said quietly, "Julian asked me last week to look into some arrangements. He didn't want to bring it up himself because he didn't want to upset you, Dad. But he said he'd feel better if we handled it together." Julian looked at the table. His jaw tightened. "I just don't want you to have to deal with it alone later," he said, his voice low and rough around the edges. "It's practical. It doesn't have to mean anything more than that." My chest cracked straight down the middle. I pressed my hand flat against the table to keep it from showing on my face. "Okay," I said. My voice came out barely above a whisper. "Okay, we'll go." Magnolia Gardens Cemetery sat on the north side of Charleston, shaded by live oaks that had been growing there longer than the city itself. We went on a Saturday morning. The air was thick and warm and smelled of cut grass and something older underneath it, and I walked those paths beside Eleanor with my hands in my pockets and my chest so full of grief that I could not speak for long stretches at a time. At one point, I stopped walking entirely. I stood between 2 rows of markers, and I thought about Margaret, about the Tuesday morning I had gotten the call, about how I had stood in a hospital corridor, not entirely different from the one Julian was being treated in, and understood in a single terrible second that the shape of my life had permanently changed. And now here I was again. Same sky. Different ground. Eleanor put her hand on my arm. "He's going to know you did everything," she said softly. "Whatever happens, Julian is going to know that." I could not answer. My eyes burned and my throat had closed completely, and I simply nodded because it was the only thing I had left. On the drive back, Eleanor reached into the bag at her feet and produced a set of documents held together with a binder clip. "I should have waited until we got home," she said, and her voice carried just enough apology to sound genuine. But the hospital's legal team actually flagged this as time-sensitive. They need a financial power of attorney on file before the next billing cycle closes. It's a liability protection measure on their end as much as ours. It just means that if any decisions need to be made quickly about accounts or payments, we're not stuck waiting. She held the documents out across the center console. "There's a notary in the car behind us," she added. "David. He used to handle legal paperwork for Mercy General when I worked there. He's done this 100 times. It'll take 5 minutes." A man climbed out of the car that had followed us from the cemetery. David Reese, mid-50s, a plain gray suit, a notary stamp in his breast pocket, and the practiced ease of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. What I did not know, and what Eleanor knew perfectly well, was that Reese's notary commission had been revoked by the South Carolina Secretary of State 6 months earlier, following a fraud investigation. His stamp was real. His authority to use it was not. I took the documents. My eyes were still burning from the cemetery. My hands were not entirely steady. I read the first page and a half before Eleanor gently turned to the signature line and pointed. "Right there, Dad, and initial here." My signature on those pages was barely recognizable as my own, loose and uneven. The handwriting of a man whose hands were shaking with grief and exhaustion. I handed the pen to Reese. He stamped and initialed with the brisk efficiency of a man who had somewhere else to be. "There," Eleanor said, taking the documents back and sliding them into her bag, with a care that, looking back, told me everything. "That's done. You did the right thing." She called me Dad 4 times on the drive home. I counted without meaning to. Each time I felt something in me lean toward the word without question, the way a plant leans toward whatever light is available, even when the light is artificial. Even when it is pointed directly at you for a reason. The amber pill bottle sat on the kitchen counter every single morning, right next to Julian's coffee mug. Same spot, same time, 7 o'clock without fail. I used to think it was a sign of a good wife, the kind of quiet, steady devotion that most people never notice until it's gone. Eleanor would come downstairs before Julian even opened his eyes, line up his supplements in a neat little row, pour a glass of water, and wait. When he shuffled into the kitchen, she'd hand him the pills one by one, watching until he swallowed each one. Dr. Walsh said that timing matters. She told me once when I asked why she didn't just leave them on the counter for him. The liver processes everything differently in the morning. He needs these taken with exactly 8 ounces of water. Not juice, not coffee. Water. I nodded. What did I know about liver function? I built commercial buildings for a living. But I remembered that morning in mid-July because Julian looked worse than I'd seen him in weeks. He came downstairs moving like a man twice his age, shoulders hunched, one hand pressed against his right side, eyes half closed even after his second cup of coffee. He dropped into the kitchen chair across from me and exhaled like the simple act of sitting down had cost him something. "You sleep okay?" I asked. He let out a short, humorless laugh. 13 hours, he said. "I slept 13 hours and I still feel like I got hit by something." Eleanor came around the counter with the pills cupped in her palm. "That's the treatment working," she said, her voice soft and certain. Dr. Walsh mentioned this phase. The body's fighting hard right now. Rest is part of healing. Julian accepted the pills without argument. He trusted her. We both did. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known standing in my own kitchen that morning, was that those small capsules had nothing to do with liver support. In the United States, deliberately giving someone a medication without their knowledge or consent is a serious federal offense. It doesn't matter if the substance is available over the counter. Intent is what the law looks at. And Eleanor's intent, as we would later discover, had never been about healing anything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That afternoon, I drove over to the Vance Construction office on Morrison Drive to handle a backlog of contracts I'd been putting off for 2 weeks. My project manager, a no-nonsense man named Pete Crowley, who'd worked for me for 11 years, met me at the door with a look I recognized immediately, the look of a man who had bad news and wasn't sure how to start. "Mr. Vance." He held the door open. "Glad you came in." There's something in the Q2 account summary I think you should see. I followed him to the conference room, where a printed spreadsheet was already laid out on the table. He pointed to a column halfway down the page. 3 transfers, he said. June 28th, July 3rd, July 11th. Each one routed to an account I don't have on file. I called the bank to flag it, but since the POA was already filed, they said the authorization was technically valid. I felt my chest tighten. I leaned over the table and stared at the numbers. $45,000, $60,000, $38,000. Who authorized these? My voice came out quieter than I intended. Pete hesitated. The filing shows Eleanor Vance acting under power of attorney on your behalf. I straightened up slowly. My hands were braced flat on the table, and I could feel the cool of the wood against my palms. A strange, hollow sensation settled somewhere behind my ribs, not quite anger, not quite fear. Something that had no name yet. Pull every transaction since June 20th, I said. Every single one. Don't touch anything. Don't call anyone. Just print it all and lock it in my office. Yes, sir. Pete was already moving. I stood at the conference room window for a long moment, looking out at the parking lot. A delivery truck was backing up slowly across the asphalt. Somewhere down the block, someone was hammering. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary afternoon. But something had just shifted inside me, a quiet, careful click, like a lock turning in a door I hadn't known was closed. I drove home that evening and sat through dinner without saying a word about what I'd found. Eleanor served pot roast. Julian ate half a plate before his eyelids started drooping again. She refilled his water glass twice. I watched her hands the whole time. Michael Hartley had been the Vance family's attorney for going on 14 years. He was the kind of man who spoke slowly on purpose, not because he was unsure of himself, but because he wanted you to hear every single word. His office on King Street smelled like old paper and coffee, and the framed law degree from the University of South Carolina hung slightly crooked on the wall behind his desk, the same way it had since the first time I walked in there. I called him the morning after Pete showed me the bank statements. I didn't explain much over the phone. I just said, I need 30 minutes. It's about the power of attorney. He told me to come in at noon. I drove there alone. I told Eleanor I had a contractor meeting. She smiled and said, "Drive safe, Dad." I didn't say anything back. Hartley read through the POA document twice before he set it down on the desk and folded his hands. His expression didn't change dramatically, but I'd known him long enough to notice the slight tension that moved across his jaw. "Arthur," he said, "do you know a man named David Reese?" "Eleanor brought him to the house," I said. "Said he was a trusted notary. We signed in the living room. Took maybe 10 minutes. Hartley turned his monitor to face me. On the screen was an official database page from the South Carolina Secretary of State's office, the Notary Public Registry. David Reese's name was right there. Next to his commission status in clear black text were 2 words, "License revoked." "Revoked on January 14th of 2025, Hartley said, pointing at the screen. 6 months before she brought him to your house this past July. "What does that mean for the document?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "It means the power of attorney is void," he said simply. "Under South Carolina law, a POA must be notarized by a licensed active notary at the time of signing. Reese had no legal authority to notarize anything. Every transfer Eleanor made using this document, every single one, was unauthorized." I sat back in the chair. My hands rested on my knees, and I pressed down just to feel something solid. "Can we freeze the accounts?" I asked. "We can," Hartley said. "But I want to counsel patience here, Arthur. If we move now, Eleanor will know we're on to her. She'll lawyer up immediately, and anything we haven't documented yet, the transfers, the medical records, the referrals, could disappear. We need a few more weeks. Let her keep thinking the POA is valid. Let her keep moving money. Every transaction she makes is another piece of evidence." He pulled a legal pad toward him and uncapped a pen. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." I talked for 40 minutes. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. I went home every evening, sat at the dinner table, watched Eleanor refill Julian's water glass, and said nothing. I watched Julian grow thinner, his color fading from tan to something closer to pale, his laugh coming less often and lasting less time. Every morning I woke up at 5 and checked the account alerts Hartley had quietly set up with the bank's fraud department. 3 more transfers came through in August. Another $62,000 routed to an LLC I'd never heard of, something called Vance Care Trust. I wrote down every number. I kept the printed statements in a locked drawer at the office, the key on my personal keychain next to the key to my late wife Margaret's jewelry box. That felt right somehow, like I was keeping both of them safe at the same time. Julian had no idea. I hated that part most. The morning of September 4th came on a Thursday, the way bad days sometimes do, quietly with clear skies and no warning. Eleanor had scheduled what she described as a critical liver procedure at Mercy General. She told Julian and me that Dr. Walsh's specialist team had determined immediate intervention was necessary. She'd handled all the pre-authorization paperwork herself. She'd spoken to the admissions office. She had a folder. She always had a folder. Julian came downstairs that morning in a clean shirt, moving slowly, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. I was already in the kitchen with my second cup of coffee. He saw me and smiled, that easy, open smile of his that reminded me so much of his mother, it sometimes knocked the breath out of me. "You don't have to come, Dad," he said. "I know you've got that East Bay project wrapping up." "The project can wait," I said. We took Eleanor's car. Julian sat in the passenger seat. I sat behind him. Eleanor drove, both hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead. She had a green scarf around her neck, and her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked perfectly composed in the way that some people look composed right before something they've planned is finally about to happen. We were about 6 minutes from the hospital when Julian shifted in his seat and turned to look back at me. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice casual, unhurried, the voice of a man who had no idea that within 3 hours his father would be standing alone in a hospital hallway, questioning everything he thought he knew. "Don't forget the electricity bill is due Friday. I set it to autopay, but the account might need a top-up. Just don't let it lapse, okay?" I looked at my son's face. Then I looked at the back of Eleanor's head. Her hands didn't move. Her shoulders didn't move. She stared at the road ahead like she hadn't heard a word. "I've got it," I said. "Don't worry about any of that." Julian nodded and turned back to face the windshield. I kept my eyes on Eleanor for the rest of the drive. Mercy General smelled the way all hospitals smell, antiseptic and recycled air with something underneath that no cleaning crew could ever quite get rid of. I'd been in enough of them over the years, mostly for Margaret, during her final months, to know that the smell hit you differently, depending on why you were there. That morning, it hit me like a warning. We checked Julian in at the front desk at 7:45. Eleanor handled everything, handed over the paperwork, spoke to the admissions clerk with practiced ease, answered every question before it was fully asked. Julian stood beside her with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, pale and quiet, looking like a man who had already made peace with whatever came next. I carried his bag. They took him through the double doors at 8:10. He turned back once before they closed behind him. Found my face in the waiting room and gave me a small nod. That was Julian, never dramatic, never one for long goodbyes. I nodded back and kept my expression steady until the doors swung shut. Then I sat down and I felt the full weight of the last 11 weeks pressed down on me all at once. Eleanor settled into the chair beside me. She crossed her legs, opened her phone, and began scrolling. No tears, no fidgeting. No restless glancing toward the doors where her husband had just disappeared. I watched her from the corner of my eye. About 40 minutes in, she stood and smoothed the front of her jacket. "I'm going to check on the pre-op timeline," she said. "Make sure everything's on schedule. You want anything from the vending machine? I'm fine, I said. She walked down the corridor toward the nurse's station, her heels clicking against the tile in a slow, unhurried rhythm. I waited 30 seconds. Then I stood and followed, staying far enough back to be invisible. She turned left at the end of the hall and disappeared into a side corridor. I kept walking straight past a supply closet, past a rolling medication cart, and stopped near the corner where the corridor opened into the pre-op staging area. 2 nurses were standing maybe 3 feet away just outside the supply closet door, one of them holding a clipboard and frowning at it. I've got a Julian Vance on the intake sheet, the first nurse said, but he's not showing in the surgical schedule. Not for today. The second nurse leaned over to look. What's the listed procedure? That's the thing, it's listed as a liver resection. But there's no attending on record, no anesthesiology booking, nothing. The only laparoscopic case on the board today is the Garfield cholecystectomy at 9:30. Could be a scheduling input error, the second nurse said. Happens with the new system. Maybe. The first nurse straightened up and tucked the clipboard under her arm. I'll flag it for patient relations. I stepped back before either of them turned around. My pulse was steady. I'd spent too many years managing construction crises to fall apart in a hallway. But my mind was moving fast, pulling at loose threads, lining things up. A liver resection. That was what Eleanor had told us. A critical procedure specialist team, immediate intervention. And yet Julian Vance was not on any surgical list at Mercy General that morning. I walked back to the waiting area. Eleanor's chair was still empty. I found the patient relations office 2 doors down from the main waiting room. A placard on the wall read, Ryan Mitchell, Patient Relations Manager. The door was half open. I knocked twice. Ryan Mitchell was a lean man in his early 40s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the organized desk energy of someone who had been in hospital administration long enough to have seen every kind of problem. He looked up when I knocked and waved me in. Mr. Vance, he checked his screen. I was actually just about to come find you. I'm seeing a flag on your son's intake file. Tell me what you see, I said. He turned the monitor slightly. Julian Vance admitted this morning for a scheduled liver resection. But when I pull up today's surgical schedule, he clicked twice. His name isn't here. No OR assignment, no anesthesiologist on record, no surgical consent logged in our system. The only consent form we have on file was submitted by fax 2 days ago, but it doesn't match our internal pre-authorization codes. Submitted by fax, I repeated. From which facility? Ryan hesitated. The originating fax number comes back to a medical office in Greenville. But when I called to verify this morning, the number was disconnected. I placed both hands flat on the edge of his desk. I kept my voice even. My son is somewhere in that pre-op area right now. He is not to undergo any procedure, not today, not until I have spoken with your chief of staff. Can you make sure that order is communicated immediately? Ryan was already reaching for his phone. Absolutely, Mr. Vance. I'll have a patient advocate with him within 5 minutes. I thanked him, turned around, and walked back to the waiting area. Eleanor's chair was empty. Her green scarf was gone. Her bag was gone. The only thing left was a faint trace of her perfume and an indentation in the seat cushion where she'd been sitting for the past hour, waiting for something that was no longer going to happen. The hallway outside the pre-op staging area was the kind of quiet that only exists in hospitals, not peaceful, just held. Every sound had somewhere to be. Footsteps, a monitor beeping behind a curtain, the distant roll of a supply cart. I walked fast. Ryan Mitchell caught up to me near the double doors and fell into step beside me without being asked. That told me something about the kind of man he was, the kind who understood when a situation had moved past paperwork. Your son is in Bay 4, he said. He hasn't been prepped. No anesthesia, no IV medication. He's asking questions. Good, I said. He should be. Julian was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, in a paper gown, his regular clothes folded on the chair beside him. He looked up when I pushed through the curtain and the confusion on his face hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't scared. He was just genuinely lost, the expression of a man who had done everything right and still ended up in a place that made no sense. "Dad." His voice was rough. "They told me the procedure's been put on hold. Something about a scheduling issue. What's going on?" I sat down next to him on the bed. The mattress was thin and the paper crinkled under my weight. I put my hand on his shoulder and I told him part of it. Not everything, not yet, but enough. I told him the surgical paperwork didn't match the hospital's records. I told him Ryan was helping me verify the documentation. I told him I needed him to sign one form so I could access his full file. Julian stared at me for a long moment. His jaw tightened. "How long have you known something was wrong?" "Long enough," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." He looked down at his hands, thinner than they used to be, the knuckles more pronounced than I remembered. Then he reached for the pen Ryan was already holding out and signed the HIPAA release without another word. His hand was steady. That steadiness cost him something. I could see it in the set of his shoulders. Ryan pulled the billing records within 20 minutes. We spread them across the small desk in his office, and I stood over them with my reading glasses on, running my finger down each line. The numbers were not subtle. Over 11 weeks, a total of $340,000 had been billed against a Vance Med Care Trust account, an account I had never opened, never authorized, and never heard of, until Pete Crowley showed me that first spreadsheet in the Morrison Drive conference room. The charges were categorized under specialist consultations, remote diagnostic services, and what the records described as ongoing treatment coordination fees. "These billing codes," I said, pointing to a column near the right margin. "Can you tell me what facility generated them?" Ryan leaned in and studied the screen. "The originating provider ID doesn't match any registered facility in our system, or in the state registry." He paused. "Mr. Vance, I want to be straightforward with you. What I'm looking at here is a documentation discrepancy significant enough that I'm obligated to flag it to our compliance office." "Flag it," I said. "Please." I stepped into the hallway and called Michael Hartley. He picked up on the second ring. "She ran," I said. "She left the hospital. I've got billing records showing $340,000 through an LLC she created. The POA is void. The surgical consent came from a disconnected fax line, and the provider ID on every charge is unregistered." There was a brief pause. When Hartley spoke, his voice had shifted into the focused, clipped tone I'd learned meant he was already 3 steps ahead. "I'll file the emergency motion to freeze all accounts tied to that LLC before noon. I'll also contact the Secretary of State's office regarding Reese. Don't confront her directly. Not yet." "Understood," I said. I hung up and leaned against the wall. Down the corridor, through the open door of Bay 4, I could see Julian pulling his shirt back on over the hospital gown. His movements were slow but deliberate, the movements of a man reclaiming something. My phone buzzed in my hand. Unknown number. One message. "You're making a mistake. Let it go." I read it twice. Then I took a screenshot, forwarded it to Hartley, and put my phone back in my pocket. Eleanor had been in control of this situation for 11 weeks. She had managed every document, every phone call, every carefully timed moment of tenderness. And now, for the first time, she was the one reacting. That told me everything I needed to know about where things stood. I got Julian home by early afternoon. He didn't ask many questions on the drive. He sat in the passenger seat and watched the road, the way people do when they're trying to organize a thought too large to speak out loud. When we pulled into the driveway, he looked at the house for a moment, before getting out, like he was seeing it differently than he had that morning. Inside, I made him eat something. Soup toast, a glass of water. He sat at the kitchen table and picked at it without complaint. The amber pill bottle was gone from the counter. I'd put it in a paper bag and locked it in my car the moment we got home. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. Before I turned off his bedroom light that night, he looked up at me from the pillow. "Dad." Is Eleanor coming back tonight? I don't know, I said. That was the truth. Okay. He closed his eyes. Wake me up if you need me. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. Then I pulled the door almost shut and went back downstairs. I didn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, I gave up pretending and drove to the office. The Morrison Drive building was empty at that hour, just the hum of the HVAC system and the glow of the security lights in the parking lot. I let myself in with my key turned on the desk lamp in my office and spread everything across the table. Pete had printed it all. Bank statements going back to June. The LLC registration documents for Vance Med Care Trust. Copies of the 3 wire transfers. The original POA document with David Reese's notary stamp. And the medical file, the one Eleanor had first handed me 10 weeks ago with both hands. Her expression carefully arranged into something that looked like grief. I opened the medical file last. It was a PDF printed on what appeared to be Mercy General letterhead dated July 2nd. It described Julian's condition in clinical language: elevated AST and ALT levels, progressive hepatic degradation, a prognosis that used words like irreversible and aggressive timeline. I had read it a dozen times over the past months. Each time it had felt like a physical blow. This time I looked at it differently. I pulled up the original digital file on my laptop. Pete had kept a copy on the internal server time-stamped from when Eleanor had emailed it to me. I right-clicked the file and opened the document properties. The metadata was still intact. Date created July 1st, 1st of July, 4:47 p.m. Author E. Vance. I sat back in my chair. 11:47 in the evening. Not a hospital administrator's workday. Not a physician's timestamp. A woman sitting alone at a computer late at night, building a document, designed to make a father believe his son was running out of time. I set the laptop aside and picked up the property folder Pete had flagged 2 days earlier. I hadn't opened it yet. I'd been waiting until I had Hartley with me. But at 4 in the morning, with the rest of the evidence spread out in front of me, I couldn't wait any longer. The filing was dated August 19th. The Vance family home on Elmwood Avenue, the house Margaret and I had bought in 1987, where Julian had grown up, where we'd had 31 years of dinners and arguments, and ordinary Tuesday evenings, had been transferred into a newly registered LLC. The signature on the transfer document was mine, executed under the power of attorney. A power of attorney that Michael Hartley had confirmed was legally void. I set the paper down very carefully. Then I picked up the last folder. Vance Construction shareholder records. 30% of the company's core shares, Julian's portions, held in trust, since he joined the business, had been assigned to Vance Med Care Trust under the same POA authorization. The transfer date was September 1st. 3 days before the hospital visit. 3 days before Eleanor had sat beside me in that waiting room and scrolled through her phone without a tremor in her hands. I called Hartley at 4:47 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which told me he hadn't been sleeping either. The house, I said. She transferred the house and 30% of the company's shares, all under the same void POA. I know. His voice was steady. I found the property filing this afternoon. I've already drafted the motion to include it. The emergency freeze covers all of it. The LLC accounts the property transfer, the share assignment. The judge is reviewing it at 8 a.m. Will it hold? Everything she moved under that POA can be reversed, he said. Every single piece. It was void from the moment Reese stamped it. I exhaled slowly. Thank you, Michael. Get some sleep, Arthur. I hung up and sat for a long time in the quiet of the office. On the corner of the desk, in a small silver frame, was a photograph of Margaret, taken the summer Julian was 12, the 3 of us standing in front of the oak tree in the backyard. She was laughing at something I'd said. She always laughed at things I said, even when they weren't particularly funny. I've got it, I said to the photograph. I've got all of it. The lamp hummed. Outside, the first gray light of morning was beginning to show at the edge of the parking lot. I had work to do. I called Sarah Coleman at 6:53 in the morning. She picked up on the third ring, her voice alert in the way that people who have spent decades in medicine learn to be alert, not startled, just ready. Arthur. She said my name the way Margaret used to say it, with a particular kind of steadiness, like the word itself was meant to hold something in place. I've been wondering when you'd call. That stopped me. What do you mean? I mean, I've been hearing things secondhand for weeks, she said. Margaret's friends talk Arthur. Nobody wanted to worry you. But when someone mentioned Julian was seeing a remote specialist, nobody could verify I started paying attention. A brief pause. Tell me what's happening. I told her everything. I stood in the parking lot of the Morrison Drive office in the early morning light jacket over my arm, and I went through all of it, the diagnosis, the supplements, the POA, the billing records, the metadata on the PDF, the facts from the disconnected number. I talked for 22 minutes without stopping. Sarah didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Bring me the pill bottle, she said. Bring me every piece of medical documentation you have. And bring Julian. Can you be here by 10? We'll be there by 9:30, I said. Dr. Sarah Coleman ran her private practice out of a converted Victorian on Rutledge Avenue, a quiet, serious building that smelled like old wood and good coffee, with diplomas on the wall, and a waiting room that had exactly 4 chairs and no television. She had been Margaret's closest friend since their freshman year at the College of Charleston, and she had been Julian's pediatrician until he turned 18. She knew his medical history better than anyone alive. She met us at the door herself. Julian had been quiet on the drive over. I'd told him that morning over coffee at the kitchen table that I needed him to come with me to see Sarah. He'd looked at me over the rim of his mug with those steady eyes of his and said, "How bad is it, Dad?" "Bad enough," I said, "but manageable. I need you to trust me a little longer." He nodded and set down his mug. "I've trusted you my whole life," he said. "I'm not about to stop now." That nearly undid me, but I kept my expression level and told him to get dressed. Sarah took the pill bottle first. She held it up to the light, examined the label, then set it carefully inside a plastic evidence bag she'd clearly prepared in advance. Then she sat Julian down and conducted the most thorough examination I'd witnessed, outside of a hospital blood draw, blood pressure, reflexes, a full abdominal assessment. She ordered an expedited ultrasound through her imaging partner 2 blocks away and had Julian there and back within 90 minutes. While Julian was at imaging, I sat in Sarah's office and she laid out what the blood work was already showing. His AST and ALT are elevated, she said, but not at the levels a genuine progressive liver condition would produce at this stage. What I'm seeing is consistent with prolonged exposure to high-dose acetaminophen, the kind of elevation you'd expect from someone taking far more than the recommended daily amount over a period of weeks. She set the lab printout on the desk between us. It's reversible, Arthur. With the right support protocol and no further exposure, his liver function should normalize within 6 to 8 weeks. I pressed my hands flat on my knees. And the tumor. The hepatic mass the diagnosis described. Sarah looked at me directly. There is no mass. The ultrasound confirms it. Julian's liver has stress markers consistent with the compound he was given, but there is no growth, no lesion, no structural abnormality of any kind. She paused to let that settle. That diagnosis was not based on any imaging I can find in his legitimate medical record. Whoever wrote that document created it without any supporting clinical evidence. I nodded slowly. I had known this was coming, had known it since the moment I'd seen Vance in the metadata, but hearing it stated plainly by a physician I had trusted for 30 years was something different. Something that moved through me like a long breath finally released. Julian came back from imaging at 12:30. Sarah sat across from him, and walked him through the results in the quiet, direct way she had. No softening, no unnecessary pauses, just the truth laid out with care. When she finished, Julian sat very still for a moment. His hands were resting on his knees, and I watched his jaw work once, twice, like he was searching for the architecture of a response and finding nothing adequate. Then his eyes filled, and for the first time in 11 weeks, I watched my son cry, not from fear, not from grief, but from the particular overwhelm of a man who has just been handed back something he believed was already gone. Sarah slid a box of tissues across the desk without comment. She'd seen this before. I moved my chair closer to his and put my hand on his back the way I used to when he was small, and the world had briefly become too large for him. He leaned forward and covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. After a while, he straightened up. He wiped his face. He looked out the window at the oak tree in Sarah's front yard, the afternoon light coming through the leaves in long, shifting patterns. 11 weeks, he said quietly. She had 11 weeks of my life. He turned and looked at me. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. Don't let her have one more day. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive home. Julian sat in the passenger seat with his elbow on the window ledge and his chin resting on his knuckles, watching the city move past outside. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in early September in Charleston, long and golden and slightly tired, like the day had been working hard and was finally letting up. I let him have the quiet. He'd earned it. It was Julian who broke it first. How long, he asked. Not accusatory, just a man who needed a number. Since late July, I said. That's when I started to see the financial irregularities. I've known about the POA since early August. He turned to look at me. You sat across from her at dinner every night for 5 weeks knowing what she was doing. Hartley told me not to move until we had everything, I said. If I'd confronted her too early, she would have had time to cover her tracks. I needed to wait. Julian faced forward again. He was quiet for another block. Then how much? I heard him exhale a long, controlled breath, the kind that takes effort to keep steady. His right hand closed slowly into a fist on his knee, then opened again. She had 11 weeks, he said. 11 weeks of me thinking I was... He stopped. Started again. I stopped making plans, Dad. I stopped thinking about next year. I canceled a fishing trip with Pete because I thought I wouldn't be well enough. His voice cracked on the last word just slightly before he pulled it back. I gave her 11 weeks of my life because I trusted her. I kept my eyes on the road. I know, I said. That's on me too. I should have seen it sooner. No. He shook his head firmly. Don't do that. This is not on you. We drove in silence for a moment. Then he straightened in his seat. And when he spoke again, his voice had shifted lower, clearer, the voice of someone who had made a decision. What's the plan? We met at the Morrison Drive office that Friday evening. Arthur Hartley and Sarah Coleman with Julian sitting at the head of the conference table in a way that told me clearly he was not there to listen passively. Pete had laid out fresh, printed copies of everything: the billing records, the metadata report. Sarah had formally documented the property transfer, filing the share assignment paperwork, and Hartley's confirmation that the emergency asset freeze had been approved by the court at 8:17 that morning. Eleanor did not yet know about the freeze. That was the thing working in our favor. Hartley spread a legal pad on the table and uncapped his pen. Here's where we stand, he said. Every financial move she made under the void POA is legally reversible. The property transfer, the share assignment, the LLC accounts, all of it can be unwound by court order. What we need now is a formal confrontation on the record. We need Eleanor in the presence of witnesses to either confirm or deny her actions. Whatever she says becomes part of the legal record. So we bring her to us, Julian said. Exactly. Hartley nodded. We need her in a controlled setting, somewhere she feels comfortable enough to speak freely. He looked at Arthur. Your home would work. A family dinner. Sarah leaned forward. I want to be there, she said. Not as a guest, as a physician. I'll have my written report with me. If Eleanor attempts to reference Julian's medical condition in any way, I can counter it on the spot, with documented clinical findings. I looked at Julian. You'd have to appear weaker than you are. Let her believe nothing has changed since the hospital. Julian almost smiled. I've spent 11 weeks being managed by that woman, he said. I think I can manage one dinner. The plan was simple by design. Sunday evening at the Elmwood Avenue house, 6 o'clock. I would play the role of a worried father still in the dark. Julian would play the role of a recovering patient. Eleanor would walk in believing she still held every card. She would be wrong about that. I drove home after midnight and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. The house felt different now that I knew what had been done inside it in the living room, where Reese had notarized a void document in the kitchen, where Eleanor had handed Julian his pills each morning with a glass of water and a practiced smile. I picked up my phone and pulled up Eleanor's contact. Her profile photo was still there, a picture from 2 Christmases ago, the 4 of us in front of the fireplace, Julian's arm around her shoulders. I typed, Julian wants to see you. Sunday dinner, 6 o'clock. I set the phone on the table and waited. The response came 11 minutes later. No explanation, no question, no softness. Okay, 1 word. But it was enough. Eleanor Vance was not a woman who walked into situations she didn't believe she could control. If she was coming to that dinner, it was because she thought she still had the upper hand. I closed my phone and looked out the kitchen window at the dark backyard, at the outline of the oak tree against the night sky. Sunday was 2 days away. Before I reveal the final confrontation comment, still here, so I know you're tracking this breakdown. Also, please note, what follows contains creative adaptations and might not be entirely factual. If this style isn't for you, feel free to turn off the video right now. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. I'd expected that. Eleanor Vance was many things, but she was never late. Punctuality was part of the performance, it said. I am reliable. I am present. I am the person this family needs. I'd admired it once. Standing in my front hallway that Sunday evening, I understood it for what it actually was. I opened the door. She looked composed in the way she always looked composed. Dark blouse hair pinned back, a bottle of Cabernet held at a precise angle in the crook of her arm. She smiled when she saw me, and it was a good smile. Warm at the edges, concerned in the middle. She had spent 3 years perfecting it. Dad. She stepped forward and kissed my cheek. How is he? Come in, I said. He's in the living room. Julian was in the armchair by the window, a blanket across his lap, looking exactly like a man still finding his footing after a difficult week. He wasn't performing much, his body genuinely hadn't finished recovering, and the fatigue in his face was real enough. But his eyes, when Eleanor crossed the room and bent to hug him, were sharper than she would have recognized from 11 weeks ago. You look better, she told him, her hand cupping his face briefly. Trying, he said. His voice was soft, easy. He gave nothing away. Sarah and Hartley were already seated at the dining table when we moved through. Sarah with a glass of water and a calm expression, Hartley with his jacket on and his reading glasses in his breast pocket. I introduced them simply. Sarah as Margaret's closest friend, someone who'd known Julian since childhood. Hartley as the family's long-standing legal counsel, someone who joined us for dinners occasionally. Eleanor shook both their hands without hesitation, offered a pleasant word to each, and took her seat. I watched her register nothing. That was either confidence or blindness. That evening I suspected it was both. Dinner was roast chicken and green beans, the same meal Margaret used to make on Sunday evenings when she wanted the house to feel settled. I'd made it deliberately. Eleanor served herself refilled Julian's water glass without being asked, and kept the conversation moving with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years managing rooms full of people. She asked about the East Bay project. She asked about Pete. She asked Julian how he was sleeping. Then, about 40 minutes in, she set her fork down and looked at me directly. "Arthur," she said, "I've been thinking about the next few months. With Julian's recovery timeline still uncertain, and Dr. Walsh recommending reduced stress for at least another 8 weeks. She paused here just briefly. I think it makes sense for me to take a more active role in the day-to-day operations at Vance Construction, just as a transitional measure, to take the pressure off both of you." The table was quiet for a moment. Sarah reached for her water glass. "Dr. Walsh," she said with the mild curiosity of someone asking about the weather. "Which practice is he affiliated with? I don't believe I'm familiar with him." Eleanor turned to her with a pleasant expression. "He's a remote specialist based out of the Minneapolis Liver Institute," she said smoothly. "He's been managing Julian's case digitally for the past several months." "Remotely," Sarah said. "No in-person examinations. The technology is quite advanced now," Eleanor said smoothly. "He reviewed all the imaging and blood work directly." "Of course." Sarah nodded. She didn't push further. She didn't need to. Eleanor turned back to me. "The POA that's already in place covers operational decisions. I just need your verbal confirmation that you're comfortable with me stepping into that role formally. It would only be temporary." I looked at her for a long moment. I kept my expression exactly as it had been all evening. Tired, concerned, the face of a man carrying a weight he didn't fully understand. "Tell me more about what that would look like," I said, and she did. She laid it out with remarkable clarity, which accounts she would oversee, which contracts she would sign off, on which decisions would route through her rather than through me or Julian. She spoke for nearly 4 minutes without interruption. Hartley, to my left, was very still. He was listening the way attorneys listen when they know a statement is going somewhere useful. When she finished, Julian shifted in his chair. "Eleanor," he said. She turned to him with an expression of gentle concern. "You should rest, sweetheart. You don't need to." "Did I agree to the share transfer?" he asked. His voice was quiet, completely quiet. "The 30%. Did I agree to it?" Something moved across Eleanor's face. It was fast there and gone in less than a second, but I had been watching her for 11 weeks, and I caught it. A recalibration. The instant adjustment of a person who has just realized the terrain has shifted beneath them. "That was a protective measure," she said carefully, "for the family's assets. In case I didn't make it," Julian said. He wasn't asking. He held her gaze without blinking. "That's what you were going to say." Eleanor opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Julian set his napkin on the table, placed both hands flat on the surface, and stood. He moved to the dining room door with the measured steps of a man who was done being managed, turned the key in the lock, and faced the room. Eleanor looked at Hartley, then at Sarah, then at me. For the first time in 11 weeks, she had nothing prepared for what she saw in our faces. The dishes were still on the table when Hartley reached into the bag beside his chair and placed 2 manila folders in the center of the tablecloth. He did it without ceremony, just set them down between the half-empty serving bowls and the unlit candles the way you'd set down something that had been waiting a long time to be put somewhere permanent. Eleanor looked at the folders. Then she looked at me. "What is this?" Her voice was measured, careful, the voice of a woman who had not yet decided which direction to move. "This," Hartley said, opening the first folder, "is the power of attorney you had executed on July 14th. And this," he slid a printed page across the table, "is David Reese's notary registration from the South Carolina Secretary of State's office. His license was revoked on January 14th of this year, 6 months before he stamped that document." Eleanor studied the page. Her expression didn't collapse. She was too controlled for that. but something in her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "There must be an error in the registry," she said. "David came highly recommended." "By whom?" Hartley asked. She didn't answer. He opened the second folder. $340,000 moved through Vance Med Care Trust between June and September. The LLC was registered under your name on June 17th, 4 days after Julian's first appointment at Mercy General. He set the registration document beside the billing records. "These are the originating provider codes on every charge. None of them match any registered medical facility in South Carolina, Georgia, or any other state." Eleanor sat very straight. "I was managing the family's medical expenses. Arthur gave me authority to—" "Arthur gave you nothing," Julian said from across the table. His voice was even and final, the way a door sounds when it closes on a room you're not going back into. The POA was void before the ink dried. Eleanor turned to him, and something shifted in her expression, then not guilt, not yet, but a kind of reaching. She leaned forward slightly. "Julian." Her voice dropped, softened. "Everything I did because I was terrified of losing you. You have to understand that." When Dr. Walsh explained how serious things were, Sarah set a bound document on the table. 12 pages clipped at the corner, her name and credentials on the cover sheet. "Dr. Kenneth Walsh does not exist," Sarah said simply. "I've checked every physician registry in the country. There is no licensed physician by that name practicing in Atlanta or anywhere else. The domain used to send his emails was registered 8 days before Julian's first appointment." She turned to the relevant page in her report. "Julian's liver shows stress markers consistent with prolonged exposure to high-dose acetaminophen. There is no mass. There is no progressive condition. With appropriate care, he will make a full recovery." The room was very quiet. I turned my laptop to face Eleanor. The PDF was open on the screen, document properties visible in the sidebar. Date created July 1st, 1st of July, 4:47 p.m. Author E. Vance. Eleanor stared at the screen. For the first time all evening, the careful architecture of her composure showed its seams. Her eyes moved from the screen to Julian, then to me, then back to the screen. Her fingers resting on the table's edge, pressed down hard against the wood. "Eleanor." Julian's voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "Did you create that document?" She looked at him for a long moment. Her lips parted. Then she looked away toward the window at the dark backyard and the outline of the oak tree against the night sky. Hartley spoke without looking up from his legal pad. "In civil proceedings, a non-answer in response to a direct question given voluntarily and in the presence of witnesses carries evidentiary weight. I want you to understand that before you choose not to respond." Eleanor turned back to the table. Her chin came up. Whatever she was feeling, and I could see it moving behind her eyes, something complicated and pressurized, she was not going to let it reach her face. Not entirely. "I did what I had to do," she said, 4 words. She said them like they explained everything, like they were the key to a door she still believed she could walk back through. Hartley wrote them down. The 4 words sat in the middle of the table like something that couldn't be taken back. Nobody moved for a moment. The candles had burned low. Outside, a car passed slowly on Elmwood Avenue, its headlights sweeping briefly across the dining room wall and disappearing. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, her chin level, her expression held together by will alone. Hartley set down his pen. He reached into his folder and slid a single document across the tablecloth toward her. Eleanor looked at the document. Something moved through her face, fast, controlled, like a current running beneath still water. Her fingers tightened in her lap. "That's not possible," she said. "The POA." Eleanor's composure cracked then. The looming threat of federal wire fraud and a criminal indictment stripped away the last of her practiced warmth. Her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing into something feral. "I was protecting this family," she said, and the warmth was entirely gone from her voice now. Julian was facing a serious condition. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to secure the assets before. Before what? Julian asked. She turned to him. Before it was too late. Too late for whom? He leaned forward slightly. The diagnosis was false, Eleanor. Dr. Walsh doesn't exist. There was nothing to protect against except the plan you built yourself. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You moved $340,000. You transferred our home. You tried to take 30% of a company my father built over 40 years. He paused. And you did it while I was sitting at that kitchen table every morning thinking I was running out of time. Eleanor's mouth opened. For a moment she looked like she might argue, like she was searching for the version of this conversation where she still came out ahead. Then something in her face went very still. Hartley slid a second document across the table. This is the POA revocation, he said. Under South Carolina law, a power of attorney can be revoked at any time by the principal effective immediately upon written notice to the agent. Arthur has signed it. I'm delivering that notice to you now in the presence of witnesses. I watched Eleanor look at my signature on the revocation form. I watched her understand fully, and finally, that there was no version of this evening she could redirect. I want to speak with my own attorney, she said. That is absolutely your right, Hartley said. I'd encourage you to do so promptly. She pushed her chair back and stood. She straightened her blouse, picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair, and turned toward the door. Julian stood and crossed to it, turned the key and pulled it open. He stepped aside without a word. Eleanor walked to the threshold. She paused there, one hand on the doorframe, her back to the room. I spoke then. I hadn't planned what I was going to say, but the words came out steady and clear the way things do when you've been holding them long enough. The house on Elmwood belongs to this family, I said. So does everything else you moved. She didn't turn around. She didn't respond. She walked out through the front hallway, and I heard the front door open and close behind her with a soft final click. Julian locked the dining room door again, out of habit, I think. Or maybe just because the action had somewhere to land, and came back to the table. He sat down in his chair and looked at the folders and the laptop and the remains of a Sunday dinner that none of us had finished. Sarah reached across and poured water into my glass without being asked. She set the pitcher down and rested her hand briefly over mine. Margaret would have handled that the same way, she said quietly. Exactly the same way. I looked at the oak tree through the window. The night was still. The candles had almost burned out completely. Not quite, I said. She would have done it 3 weeks faster. The Morrison Drive office looked exactly the same as it always had. Same coffee maker on the credenza. Same project maps pinned to the wall beside the window. Same worn patch on the carpet in front of Pete's desk, where he'd stood for 11 years, making phone calls and refusing to sit down because he claimed he thought better on his feet. Julian stopped in the doorway for a moment when we arrived that Tuesday morning in early October. He had one hand on the doorframe, not for support, just the gesture of a man taking in a room he hadn't seen in a while. His color was better. Not all the way back, but closer. Sarah had told us that morning that his liver function numbers had improved significantly in the past 3 weeks ahead of her projected timeline. Pete looked up from his desk. He stood immediately. There he is, Pete said. His voice came out rougher than usual. He crossed the room in 4 strides and shook Julian's hand the way men do when they mean something more than a handshake. Both hands firm, held a beat longer than necessary. Good to have you back, Mr. Vance. Julian clapped him on the shoulder. Good to be back, Pete. How's the East Bay project? 3 days ahead of schedule. Pete grinned. Figured you'd want something to be right when you walked in. Julian laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard from him since before any of this started. It moved through the room like something that had been missing from it for a long time. Hartley called at 10:30 with the update I'd been waiting for. The court had formally reversed all asset transfers, executed under the void POA. The Elmwood Avenue property was restored to the Vance Family Trust. Julian's 30% share assignment had been unwound and returned to its original standing. Every transaction Eleanor had moved through Vance Medcare Trust had been clawed back into the frozen account, pending final settlement. She signed the civil agreement this morning, Hartley said. Full repayment of the $340,000 structured over 18 months. Her attorney advised her it was the most viable path given the weight of the evidence. And Reese? I asked. The Secretary of State's office referred his case to the county prosecutor last week. Notary misconduct under South Carolina Code carries fines and potential license revocation permanent this time. He's cooperating. I thanked him and set the phone down on my desk. Through the glass partition, I could see Julian at the conference table, with a set of project drawings spread in front of him, Pete leaning over beside him, pointing at something on the plans. Julian was nodding, making notes in the margin with a pencil. His hand was steady. 11 weeks. That was what Eleanor had taken. 11 weeks of a man's life, his sense of his own future, his ability to make a plan and believe he'd be around to see it through. The law could reverse a property transfer. It could claw back money. It could revoke a license and unwind a fraudulent document. It could not give back 11 weeks. But watching Julian turn a page of the project drawings and say something that made Pete laugh out loud, watching that ordinary, unremarkable moment happen in a room that had been waiting for it, I understood that some things find their way back on their own. We ate lunch at the conference table. Sandwiches from the place on King Street that Julian had been ordering from since his first week at the company. He ate the whole thing, which he hadn't been able to do in months, and then leaned back in his chair with his coffee and looked at the ceiling the way he did when he was thinking through something. Sarah wants me to do one more round of blood work next week, he said. She thinks by Thanksgiving I'll be at baseline. She's usually right about these things, I said. She's always right about these things. He smiled. Then he looked over at me. Hey, Dad. Yeah, the electricity bill. He said it the same way he'd said it in the car on the way to the hospital, easy, almost offhand, like it was the most natural thing in the world to mention. I reset the autopay last week. New account number. Just wanted you to know it's handled. I looked at my son across the conference table. The sandwiches were half unwrapped between us. The project drawings were still spread out at the far end. Through the window, the October sun was doing something generous with the light on Morrison Drive, turning the ordinary street outside into something almost golden. My chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with grief. I know, I said. I knew you'd handle it. He nodded and picked up his coffee. Outside, a truck rumbled past. Pete's phone rang in the next room. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Tuesday came back into the office like they'd never left. November came in quietly, the way it does in Charleston, not with cold that hits you all at once, but with a gradual cooling, like the city was letting the year down gently. The oak tree in the backyard had started dropping leaves. Not many, just enough to remind you that things were changing. Hartley called on a Wednesday afternoon. Julian was in the next room. I took the call at my desk and listened, and when he finished, I sat for a moment before I went to find my son. Julian was in the kitchen pouring coffee. He looked up when I came in. Eleanor filed the paperwork this morning, I said. Uncontested. Her attorney recommended it given the circumstances. Hartley says the proceedings will finalize before the end of the year. Julian set the coffee pot down. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard for a moment, at the oak tree, at the leaves on the ground, at the ordinary late afternoon light falling across the yard. Then he picked up his mug and took a slow sip. Okay, he said, one word. But it carried something in it. Not relief, exactly. Not sadness, exactly. But the particular weight of a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a long time, and finding that his hands felt strange without it. You all right? I asked. He turned from the window. I will be, he said, and he meant it. I could hear it. That evening, we sat on the back porch as the sun went down. Julian had found the old outdoor chairs in the garage. The ones Margaret had bought the summer Julian turned 16, green canvas and wood frames slightly faded now, but solid. He'd set them up facing the yard without saying anything about it, and when I came outside, he handed me a cup of coffee and sat down beside me. The yard was quiet. A few leaves drifted down from the oak tree in the still air. Pete rebooked the fishing trip, Julian said after a while. First weekend of December, Lake Murray. He looked over at me. You should come. I haven't fished in 15 years, I said. I know. He almost smiled. That's why I'm inviting you. Pete needs someone to feel better than. I laughed. A real one, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected. We sat without talking for a while after that. But it was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. The oak tree stood at the far end of the yard, its upper branches catching the last of the light. I thought about the photograph on my desk. Margaret laughing. Julian, 12 years old. The three of us standing right there under that tree on a summer afternoon that had seemed ordinary at the time, and now seemed like something I'd have given a great deal to step back into for just a moment. She knew, you know, Julian said quietly. Mom, she always knew when something was off. She never said anything dramatic about it. She'd just get very calm and very focused, and then things would get handled. He paused. You did that. These past few months. That was her in you. My throat tightened. I kept my eyes on the tree. She was better at it, I said. Maybe. Julian set his mug down on the armrest. But you were here. She wasn't. And you didn't let go. He stood after a while, stretched, picked up both our mugs. At the back door, he stopped and turned around. Thanks for not giving up, Dad. Then he went inside. I stayed on the porch a little longer. The yard was almost dark now, just the outline of the oak tree against the deep blue of the evening sky. The house behind me was lit and warm, and I could hear Julian moving around in the kitchen, the small, ordinary sounds of someone at home in a place that belonged to them. For the first time in a long time, this house felt like mine again. I hadn't touched my fishing gear in 15 years. I knew it was in the hall closet buried somewhere behind Julian's old lacrosse equipment, and 2 boxes of Margaret's gardening books that I still hadn't been able to donate, but I hadn't actually put my hands on it since the summer Julian turned 19, when the 2 of us had driven up to Lake Jocassee for a long weekend and caught exactly nothing and considered the trip a complete success anyway. I found it at 4:45 in the morning, standing in the dark hallway, with my phone flashlight pulling out the old rod case and trying to remember if the reel still worked. It did mostly. The line was brittle in places. I made a note to ask Pete if he had a spare. I was tying my boots on the hallway bench when my phone rang. Sarah's name on the screen at 5:30 in the morning was enough to make my heart kick once before I answered. Arthur. Her voice was bright in a way that medical professionals reserve for the moments they've been waiting to deliver. I got Julian's lab results back late last night. I wanted you to have them before you left this morning. I stopped moving, boot in hand, the lace half-threaded. His liver function is back to baseline, she said. Full recovery. Every marker ASTALT bilirubin, the whole panel within normal range. He's completely cleared. I pressed the phone harder against my ear as though I needed the words closer to understand them. Sarah. My voice came out lower than I intended. Say that one more time. Full recovery, Arthur. I could hear her smiling. Whatever she gave him over those 11 weeks, his body processed it. He's healthy. He was always going to get here once we removed the source. A brief pause, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something warmer underneath the clinical precision. You can breathe now. Both of you. I sat on that bench for a full minute after I hung up. The house was quiet around me. The hallway light was still off, and in the gray pre-dawn dark, I could make out the small silver frame on the console table across from me, the photograph of Margaret and Julian from a 4th of July when he was maybe 8 years old. The two of them squinting happily into the sun on the back porch. I picked up the frame and held it for a moment. "He made it," I said quietly. "You would have loved watching him make it." I set it back down, finished lacing my boot, and went to knock on Julian's door. He was already awake. I could hear him moving around. Before I knocked, the particular rhythm of a man who had somewhere to be and was actually looking forward to it. He opened the door in his jacket thermos already in hand, eyes clear in a way that still struck me fresh every time I saw it. 2 months ago, those same eyes had been dull and sunken and carrying the weight of a man who had stopped trusting the morning. "Sarah called," I said. He read my face immediately. His jaw worked once, and I watched something move through his expression, not surprise, but a kind of deep, private relief, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles in the chest, like a stone finally finding the bottom of still water. "Baseline," he asked. "Baseline," I said. He exhaled slowly. He reached out and gripped my shoulder once firmly, not a hug, not a breakdown, just a man acknowledging something important had arrived and choosing to carry it quietly. That was Julian. That had always been Julian. "Good," he said. "Now let's go catch some fish." We picked Pete up at 5:45. He was standing in his driveway in full fishing gear, with 3 thermoses, and an expression of profound satisfaction at being the most prepared person present, which was accurate. He looked Julian up and down once and said nothing, but I saw his shoulders drop half an inch, the involuntary release of a man who had been holding something tight without realizing it. "You look like a person again," Pete told him, climbing into the back seat. "High praise," Julian said. "It is from me," Pete said, and handed him a thermos. The drive to Lake Murray took just over an hour. The interstate was empty that early, the sky ahead of us shifting from black to dark blue to the particular pale gray of a winter morning that hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. Julian had the radio on low, something instrumental, unhurried, and the 3 of us drove through the early dark the way people do when they're comfortable enough with each other not to need to fill the space. Somewhere past the Lexington exit, Julian turned to look at me from the passenger seat. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, the way he got when he was choosing his words carefully. "When did you actually know, not suspect?" "No." I thought about it honestly. "The metadata," I said. "The night I sat in the office at 4 in the morning and right-clicked that PDF. When I saw her name in the author field and the timestamp at 11:47 at night." I kept my eyes on the road. Everything before that was suspicion. That was the moment it stopped being a question. Julian nodded slowly. "And you just kept going. Sat across from her at dinner. Watched her hand me those pills every morning. Hartley said we needed everything before we moved," I said. "So I waited. That must have been—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't know if I could have done that. Sat there and said nothing." "You would have," I said. "You're more patient than you think you are." He was quiet after that. But it wasn't the heavy quiet from before, not the silence of a man carrying something too large. It was the quiet of someone processing a story that had finally reached its end, turning the last few pages over in his mind and deciding what to keep. Lake Murray in early December was exactly what I needed without knowing I needed it. The boat was small and slightly damp, and smelled like lake water and old rope, and the mist sat low over the surface in long, unmoving layers that the morning light hadn't yet touched. Pete set the anchor about 200 yards from the east bank, handed out the rods, and declared that the first person to talk about work for the next 2 hours owed him lunch. We fished. We drank coffee. A great blue heron worked the shallows about 50 yards to our left, moving with the particular self-contained purpose of a creature that has never once in its life been in a hurry. About 40 minutes in, Pete broke the quiet with a story about a subcontractor on the East Bay project who had misread the rebar specifications not once but twice and who had responded to the second correction with such genuine moral indignation that Pete had been genuinely impressed. Julian started laughing before Pete got to the punchline, which meant he'd already heard it from Pete directly, which meant they had been talking. Really talking the way they used to, and something about knowing that loosened something in me that I hadn't realized was still wound up. Julian looked better than he had in over a year. The hollowness was gone from his face. His jacket fit properly again. When he reeled in his line to recast, the movement was fluid and careless, the movement of a man whose body had stopped being a source of worry and become simply the thing he lived in. After a while, he set his rod across his knees and looked out at the water. "I've been thinking about next year," he said. "The residential side. Pete and I pulled some numbers last week. There's real demand in the West Ashley corridor that nobody's moving on. Mid-range owner-occupied. If we bring on 2 project leads by March and break ground in the spring." "How much runway do we need?" I asked. He glanced over at me. A small smile. "You want the actual number?" "I want the actual number." He gave it to me. We talked for 20 minutes, not the way we'd talked about the company over the past 3 months, with everything filtered through the weight of what was happening, but the way we used to talk. 2 people who trusted each other's judgment, working through a problem for the straightforward reason that they both wanted to build something good. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the question surfaced, the one that had been sitting at the bottom of everything for months. Why? Not the mechanics of what Eleanor had done, those I had laid out in a conference room and a dining room and a lawyer's office and understood as completely as I was ever going to. But the deeper thing. What kind of person makes that choice? What she had been looking for, that she had decided could only be reached that way. I turned it over. I held it up to the early December light on Lake Murray and examined it from a few different angles. Then I put it down, not because I had found an answer, because I understood sitting in that boat with my son 3 feet away, making plans for spring, that the question was not mine to carry anymore. Whatever Eleanor Vance had been moving toward when she set all of that in motion, whatever she had imagined she would find on the other side of it, that was a weight she would carry forward alone. The damage she'd caused was being undone. The people she had tried to take from were sitting on a lake in the early morning, drinking bad coffee and arguing about rebar and talking about the future. I picked up my rod and cast the line back out into the water. The mist was lifting. Down the bank, the heron spread its wings once and resettled. Pete was telling another story. Julian was laughing again, that full, unguarded laugh that lived somewhere in the register of the best sounds I have ever heard in my life. I let the morning do the rest. I was up at 5 on Christmas morning, the way I had been every Christmas morning since Margaret passed. Not by choice exactly, but because the house has a particular quality at that hour on that day that I have never been able to sleep through. A kind of held expectation in the walls. The specific quiet of a place that remembers what it used to sound like. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the overhead light. Just the small lamp on the counter, the one Margaret had found at an estate sale on James Island, and insisted on keeping even though the shade was slightly crooked, and I had replaced the bulb 4 times. I had never moved it. I probably never would. The first Christmas after we lost her had been the hardest thing I had ever done, and I had done some hard things in my life. Julian had come home from Charleston that year, and we had both moved through the day carefully, the way you move through a room where something valuable has been placed on the floor. We cooked a meal neither of us was hungry for. We watched a football game neither of us was following. At some point in the evening, without either of us planning it, we had simply sat down at the kitchen table and talked about her for 3 hours, not about the stroke, not about the hospital, but about the actual woman. The way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. The way she had strong opinions about the correct ratio of butter to flour in a pie crust. The way she had for 31 years of marriage somehow always known what I needed before I knew it myself. That night had done something for both of us that nothing else had managed. It had turned her from an absence back into a presence. 5 years on, I still started every Christmas morning at this table in this light, with this coffee, with that conversation somewhere in the back of my mind. Julian came downstairs at 7:20. I heard him before I saw him, the creak of the third step from the top, which had been announcing family members since 1989, and which I had decided years ago I would never fix. He came around the corner in the old Clemson sweatshirt he'd had since his junior year, his hair doing something independent, and stopped when he saw me at the table. "You're already up," he said. "I'm always already up." He poured himself a mug and sat across from me, and for a while we just shared the quiet of the kitchen, the way you can only do with someone whose silences you've known long enough to read. Outside, the street was still. The oak tree in the backyard was a dark shape against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be gray or blue. "Merry Christmas, Dad. Merry Christmas." He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked out the window. His color was good, genuinely good, the kind that comes from the inside rather than the surface. I had watched that color return over the past 3 months, the way you watch a tide come in gradually, and then all at once. "I want to make breakfast," he said. "Actual breakfast, not just coffee. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He stood and opened the refrigerator. "That's the point." So we cooked. Julian found eggs and the last of the good bacon, and I cut up the sourdough we'd bought 2 days before, and for 40 minutes we moved around each other in the kitchen, the way we used to when he was a teenager. And Saturday mornings meant whoever was up first started the coffee, and whoever came down second handled the eggs without being asked. It was an old rhythm, easy to step back into, and neither of us commented on how long it had been absent. While Julian handled the bacon, I set the table. 2 plates, 2 mugs, the good cloth napkins Margaret had bought in Savannah on a trip we'd taken for our 20th anniversary. I used them every Christmas. She would have considered using paper napkins on Christmas Day an act of personal failure, and I had adopted that position as my own. "She would have had opinions about the bacon," Julian said, watching the pan. "She had opinions about everything," I said. "Specific, actionable opinions." He adjusted the heat. "The kind that turned out to be right." "Usually," I said. "Not always." He glanced back at me. "Name one time she was wrong." I thought about it. "The sofa," I said. 1998. She wanted that green one from the store on King Street. I said it would look wrong in the living room. And it looked wrong in the living room. Julian laughed. A good laugh, uncomplicated, the kind that filled the kitchen and went somewhere. "She loved that sofa anyway," he said. "She did," I agreed. I came around eventually. After breakfast, Julian reached under his chair and produced a small box. He set it on the table between us and pushed it toward me without ceremony, just a quiet slide across the tablecloth, the gesture of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally found the right moment to put it down. "I found it when we cleared out her things," he said, "right after she passed. I wasn't sure what to do with it. I kept it in my desk for 5 years, because every time I thought about giving it to you, I couldn't figure out if the timing was right." He looked at me steadily. "I think the timing is right." I opened the box. Margaret's watch. Silver band, clean face, no ornamentation. She had chosen it herself from 3 options I had presented to her at a jeweler on Broad Street the first year. Vance Construction turned what I considered a real profit. We had gone on a Friday afternoon, the 2 of us, and she had stood at the display case and studied each option with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and then she had pointed to the plainest one and said, "That one, it'll last." It had lasted 22 years. She had worn it to Julian's school plays and his college graduation, and our daughter-in-law's wedding, and every ordinary Tuesday in between. I hadn't seen it since the week I lost her. My throat closed in that particular way that has no warning and no solution except to sit with it. I turned the watch over in my hands. The back was smooth. I had thought about engraving it once early on, and Margaret had talked me out of it, said she preferred it plain, said she didn't need words on metal to remember what it meant. She was right about that, the way she was right about most things that mattered. She wore it every day, Julian said quietly. Every single day. I don't think I ever saw her without it. No, I said. Neither did I. I think it should be with you, not in a desk drawer. With you. I put it on. The clasp was a little stiff from years of storage, and I worked it twice before it caught. It settled on my wrist, the way it was supposed to, not heavy, not light, just present the way the right things always are. Thank you, I said. It came out rough, but it was enough. Julian nodded. He picked up his coffee. He understood, as he had always understood, that some moments don't need to be expanded. We took our mugs out to the back porch after the table was cleared. The yard was still and pale in the morning light, the grass holding the last of the night's frost. The oak tree standing at the far end, with its bare branches spread against a sky that had finally settled on gray with light behind it. We stood side by side at the railing without talking for a while, which was the right thing to do. I've been thinking, Julian said eventually. About the bench, I said. He turned to look at me. How did you know? You mentioned it in November. You said you wanted something permanent out there. He looked back at the tree. It doesn't have to be elaborate. Just something solid. Something that'll be there in 20 years. He paused. I want to build it ourselves, not subcontract it. Actually build it. I looked at the oak tree, at the ground beneath it, at the particular quality of light that fell there in the afternoon, at the grass that was slightly greener under its canopy than anywhere else in the yard. I thought about what it would mean to put something permanent in that ground, something the two of us had made with our hands, something that would be there on ordinary Tuesdays for years to come. We'll need good wood, I said. Nothing that'll rot. White oak, Julian said immediately. To match. That's not a practical reason. It's the right reason. I looked at him. He looked back at me, and there was something in his face in that moment, unhurried, certain, looking outward at the yard with his late mother's eyes that I will carry for the rest of my life. White oak, I said. We start in March when the ground softens. He nodded. He lifted his mug slightly, the smallest of gestures, and I lifted mine in return. The morning was quiet around us. The frost was beginning to lift off the grass in the thin winter sun. Somewhere on the street, a car started and pulled away, the sound fading into the distance, until the yard was silent again, except for the faint movement of bare branches overhead. I stood on that porch with my son beside me and my late wife's watch on my wrist, and I looked out at the ground where we were going to build something together in the spring, and I understood, not for the first time but more completely than I had before, that this was what outlasting something looked like. Not the absence of loss, not the erasure of the 11 weeks that Eleanor had taken, or the 5 years since Margaret, but the presence of what remained. The coffee, the bacon, the crooked lamp, the watch that had lasted, the oak tree, the bench we hadn't built yet, the things you show up for. Next year, I said, not to myself this time, but out loud to my son standing beside me. He turned. Next year we do this better, I said. Julian was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved just slightly. Deal, he said. The morning opened up ahead of us. We stayed on the porch a little longer until the coffee was finished, and the frost was gone, and the sky had made up its mind to be clear after all. Going through this storm, I realized the biggest tragedy is turning a blind eye to warnings because of blind trust. Looking back, I thank God for guiding us and giving my son and me the strength to uncover the truth before it was too late. I look at my own choices and offer this piece of advice: do not be like me. Do not let your pride or love blind you to the darkness of the person sleeping next to you. Never wait until your family's lives and assets are directly threatened to wake up. My view is clear: trust must always go hand in hand with constant vigilance. This was a bitter family drama revenge, but a necessary lesson in caution. People often read a family stories, revenge for entertainment, but facing a real-world family drama, revenge shows the true cost of being naive. I had to turn my pain into a calculated family stories revenge to protect what matters. These sophisticated family drama revenge plots hide behind the warmest smiles, and the ending of our family stories, revenge, stands as a final warning for everyone. Thank you so much for following our journey until the very end. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Warning: future stories contain fictionalized elements built for educational purposes. If you prefer not to listen to this type of content, please exit and choose another topic.